Good morning.
Good morning.
Well, good to see you all. Hello. Hello, I can see some of you who are joining online. It's nice to see you. I'm going to give a talk today about this book that I wrote, which is called Vasubandhu's Three Natures. The original publication date was for Wednesday, but supply chain issues. So the world is complicated, and we work together to make things happen. And so a lot of people are working together to make this book be published on November 5th. But there are a lot of events set up, so I guess as they say, the show must go on. So I'm just really grateful that I get to do this. I'm really grateful I get to share the teachings of Vasubandhu with you, which are so meaningful to me and seem like they set such an amazing template for integrating personal and collective healing and liberation. And, really grateful for this place. I remember the first time I saw Yogacara text, Tim Burkett was sitting there in our study group, and he passed out the 30 verses on consciousness only, and I thought, this makes zero sense. No sense. But we hung out with it together, and something happened. And I just came to study groups and practice periods here for a long time, and I still do. And it seems to be beneficial for me and the people that I know. So I'm really, really grateful for all the support. And there's going to be cake, apparently. That's really nice. Kimberly's like, we're getting you a cake. So thank you all. And the term Vasubandhu, Three Natures, may be utterly unknown to you. So what I'll say is Vasubandhu is a 4th century Indian monk who's associated with a movement of Buddhism called Abhidharma and also associated with another movement called Yogacara. And then he integrated the two, which is a long story. But anyway, a really influential figure in Buddhism who the teachings that I'll be talking about here, you see them reflected throughout East Asian and Tibetan Buddhism. And one of the cool things about Vasubandhu is he changed his mind a lot. So not just back and forth, but you see over his lifetime, him really be like, I've created this really beautiful vision. Everyone would be like, you nailed it. That's the most perfect exposition ever. And they'd be like, yeah, sorry, I got it wrong. Let me put in some notes and do a little better. So really emphasize the process, that liberation is a process. The Dharma is not something that you arrive at. It's like, now we figured it out. We just kept going. And so I think that invitation is there for all of us. Yogacara is a movement in Buddhism that you don't really find, besides the Hoso school in Japan, Yogacara schools, but the teachings of Yogacara permeate, as I say, many, many schools of Buddhism. And the basic idea was to integrate early Buddhist psychology with the Mahayana emphasis on collective liberation. You could say early Buddhist psychology with the Mahayana emphasis on emptiness, but half the people might fall asleep in this talk, so I'll say collective liberation, because maybe that will have a little bit more practical meaning for you. So, one of the reasons that I find these teachings so compelling is that when I first came to Buddhism, I read a lot of Thich Nhat Hanh. And Thich Nhat Hanh, as many of you know, is like a Vietnamese teacher who recently died, who pioneered what is now understood to be engaged Buddhism, although I don't think there's any other kind. I mean, what did the Buddha do? He realized liberation, and then he spent his whole life helping people and living a life of supreme simplicity. So I don't know, the idea that there is some non-engaged Buddhism seems very strange. But I know that he coined the term because he noticed that the monks in his country were withdrawing into their monasteries and away from their communities. And so Thich Nhat Hanh sort of actively formed a movement that he called Engaged Buddhism, and he uses Yogacara teachings constantly. And you can really see how the Yogacara philosophy is what underlies his understanding. So here's a person, one of the great geniuses of 20th century, 26th century Buddhism, who was like, well, he really understands the Dharma. Sometimes people will say, oh, he's a little bit, it's kind of light or mushy. And it's like, but then when he wants to talk very precisely about the Dharma, he knows it. And he looked broadly at the tradition. He's like, where can I find a really strong Dharmic basis for doing something where we're not withdrawing, where we can, integrate deep monastic practice with a total commitment to community and to ending these harms that we live in, which are so many. So an overview of the three natures, and for those of you for whom this is new material, you might be like, wow, this is really weird. It is a startlingly different worldview than probably the one most of us were raised with. So that's why you have to write a whole book about it. Or maybe there are tomes and tomes of books about it. I've read several of them. So the three natures are the imaginary nature, the dependent nature, and the complete realized nature. The Parikalpita, Paratantra, and Parinirvana Svabhavas. So the imaginary nature of things is what you think they are. By the way, everything you experience is of these three natures, according to this teacher. So teaching, the imaginary nature of things is what you think they are. That is, if you think something is a thing, it's imaginary. Okay. The dependent nature is that they appear to exist dependent on conditions. In particular, they appear to exist dependent on conditions that are not themselves. And the complete realized nature is they're not what you think they are. Well, that's simple. That's simple. So another way to think of this, the imputational, sometimes people will say the imaginary nature, they describe it as imputational nature. So whatever you impute a thing to be, that's its imaginary or imputational nature. And that thing is not whatever you impute it to be, because it's just a bunch of other stuff. You have to ignore all the other conditions to believe it to be what you think it is. And the fact that it already isn't what you think it is the complete realized nature. And why does this matter? Well, that's what we'll talk about a little bit more. But in particular, the complete realized nature is we suffer because we think things are how they are. And this is saying nothing that you think you can hold on to can be held on to. Nothing that you think you can push away can be pushed away. And all the suffering that comes from trying to push away and get things and hold on to things is based on illusion. And we can do something about it. So I'm just going to read a little bit from this little volume. Every aspect of what we would conventionally call experience is of these three natures: sights, sounds, smells, tastes, physical sensations, thoughts, emotions, and our sense of being a self. For example, the cobalt blue car that I can see outside my window is of an imaginary nature. Whatever I'm experiencing it to be right now, a memory, as I'm currently looking at letters on a screen, or now, as I turn my head to look at it again, is a construction of habits of consciousness and imagination. I suspect it will take some time for you to consider this a reasonable or useful claim. And so, dear reader, that's why I'm writing this book. That car is also of a dependent nature. Countless conditions that are not the car create the appearance of a car. Reflected sunlight, ocular nerves, supply chain software, oil refineries, the desire for wealth, and so on. The car is also of a complete realized nature. It isn't what I think it is. Recognizing that things aren't what you think they are can radically disarm the patterns of your mind that cause you to suffer and cause suffering. For example, in order to see the car in my normal way, I am usually ignorant of or ignore a vast array of conditions on which the appearance of the car depends. Conditions that cause suffering in this time of climate crisis. These teachings are help us to move beyond this kind of ignorance. The so-called knowledge that white people are inherently superior to black people and the so-called fact that race exists as a biological truth were confirmed by 19th century scientific experiments, which have since been disproven. This caused and causes incalculable harm. This so-called knowledge is imaginary. It arises from conditions, and its complete realized nature is that it is not real. And yet, millions of people thought and still think it is true. Although many of us do not, the impacts of this view are pervasive. It affects where people live, the jobs we have, the wealth we inherit, our access to education, and so much more. They are alive in how I experience the world. This teaching is here so we may continually grow in our capacity to end and transform harmful patterns of which we are often unaware. By learning to see the three natures of the ideas that maintain harmful systems, we open the way for liberation. The three natures can be misapplied and easily misunderstood. Understanding the imaginary nature invites humility, not grandiosity. It affirms agency. It does not deny experiences. Understanding the dependent affirms kinship with all things. It does not deny differences or boundaries. Understanding the complete realized nature brings faith, compassion, and joy. It does not deny suffering. The three natures provide medicine for our ongoing daily sufferings, no matter how small. So the real challenge of this teaching is when you say something is imaginary, people immediately say you're dismissing it as being important, usually. And that can come across, it can be very painful. So it is hard to continually convey the fact that the whole point of the imaginary nature is that it is really important. That's all we experience, and we are actively imagining together and can make something else, which is the point of Buddhism. So when we say something is imaginary, we're saying, yes, we're making this now, and we always contribute to what will be made. So in this case, even though, for example, race is not real, the impacts of race are real. And just like you say, oh, I'm really hungry, and I could say, well, the hunger is an imaginary nature. I wouldn't say that to you, okay. But it doesn't mean that it doesn't matter. It just means it's not what you think it is. Many conditions produce it. And then the invitation is to think about what are the conditions I can contribute to that will make the situation better. So, the imaginary nature closely associated with the idea of karma. So, one of the reasons that the Yogacara wants to talk about the imaginary nature is they want to create a system of understanding that includes emptiness, for those of you who are into this sort of thing, but affirms that what we do matters. So the reason you have karma in Buddhism is to explain why you can do something beneficial. And some of the Buddhist teachings that were coming up made it harder and harder to understand why what you did could be beneficial and why karma made sense as a system. So Yogacara teachings want to say, we want to give you a reason to understand why what you do matters, always. Every moment, we are planting seeds that create the conditions for what will be imagined by all of us. So it's like your actions always matter. And this is such an enormous emphasis, especially in early Buddhist teachings. And it's like on the Han up there, the thing we strike to signal Zazen, that thing says, do not waste your precious life. It's a reminder that you're a conscious being, so you have the capacity to contribute to liberation. So I'll read a short passage from the book related to this aspect of these teachings. So the idea is we plant seeds, and those seeds will bear fruit. We plant seeds of compassion, they'll bear fruit of compassion. We plant seeds of anger that bears fruit in the form of anger. And when we experience anger, that's the fruit of past seeds of anger. This includes like ways we perceive things, bodily actions. You had to plant a lot of seeds to figure out how to tie your shoes, right? Probably don't remember not being able to do that. Now, if you try and stop and think about it, it's hard. Our body just does it. A lot of seeds were planted. Yogacara gives us the metaphor of karmic seeds in the field of mind to help us see that we can cultivate wellness. James Baldwin once wrote, "People pay for what they do, and still more for what they have allowed themselves to become. And they pay for it simply by the lives they lead." A central tenet of Buddhist thought is that each action produces a similar result. If you feel angry and shout, you plant seeds of anger and shouting. If you feel calm and confident and ask someone to stop doing something harmful, you plant seeds of calm and assertiveness. If you open an online shopping site each time you feel sad, you plant seeds of sadness, avoidance, and consumption. Those seeds will bear fruit, though we do not know when or where. Our tendencies towards feelings and actions in any moment are the result of conditioning that goes back farther than any of us can comprehend. As the Buddha says many times in the Pali Canon, these tendencies are without discoverable beginning. Traumas, joys, insights, and countless moments of calm going back generations bring us this moment. The impulse to recoil from the discomfort that you experience when sweat drips into your eyes on a hot day couldn't have appeared without microorganisms recoiling from stimuli millions of years ago. But here is the good news and the central thesis of Buddhism. You are not merely a victim of karma. You always have the capacity to do something beneficial. In each moment, you can respond to what is arising, the results of karma, with something that will plant karmic seeds for future benefit. Karma is the way to understand why what you do matters and how you can do something that will promote true well-being. The Buddhist idea of karma is fundamentally about empowerment. So this is one aspect of the imaginary nature. It's like we construct the imagination through this process of seeds being planted. Another thing is that this affirms imagination. And I think this is very helpful, because some Zen teachings, it's like, oh, you're just going to sit and look at the wall and go beyond conceptualization and just meet sensory experience with no mental activity. I highly recommend it. Really good idea. Even if it only happens for like half a second, it's pretty good. But it's also true that for any of us who spent many hours looking at a wall, sometimes it's like watching cartoons. It's like, how did the wall do all that stuff? Amazing. You really see, if you take away stimulation, the mind still creates a very vivid and exciting and dramatic world. Like how many people here have been on a session where there's nothing happening, no one's talking to anyone, no one's interacting, and you're still like, I can't believe he did that. Wow. You see, the conditioning to produce all this suffering, it's in there. It's less out there, much less out there than we think. But the other implication is just sort of a celebration of imagination. So, this is not much of a part of the Zen tradition, but like in Tibetan traditions, you spent a lot of energy developing visualizations. So developing the power of imagination, so you practice imagining something beautiful and wonderful and amazing. Because actually it might be fine to have something beautiful, wonderful, and amazing. So I'm just going to read a little thing related to this. This verse upholds one of the central tendencies of Yogacara thought. It affirms that something is happening and denies that it's what you believe it to be. In particular, Vasubandhu here reminds us that the illusion exists. So there's kind of a previous passage of the book where he's talking about like this moment, whatever, even though it's illusory, it exists, as he says, as mere imagination. What are illusions for if not joyful engagement? Sometimes people claim that saying things are illusory means we will not or should not care about them. This does not reflect my experience. We naturally delight in and marvel at magic tricks. We walk into plays, movies, and songs and stories willing to be deeply moved or challenged. At the movies, people cry in the dark or cringe at a shock. My hand is a little sore because last night I was holding my spouse's hand while we watched a movie, and it was really scary. You're like, oh, what's going to happen? Wow. We dove in. We dove in. We create illusions, and they transform us. We know that Wonder Woman isn't real, I think, and she inspires. We offer our whole selves to the experience of the illusions, the stories that artists offer. We can pour our whole selves more deeply into life when we realize that it exists as an illusion rather than as something to be grasped. So, a little something about the imaginary nature. The dependent nature, so we have imaginary, dependent, and complete realized nature. I'm going to work through them here. Dependent nature, it's this idea that each thing, although it appears to be a distinct thing, we are ignoring countless things that are not the thing on which it depends in order to see it as separate. So this is the basic process of how we construct a universe. We ignore dependencies or are ignorant of. So there's, we have greed, hate, and delusion in Buddhism, the three main karmic suffering processes. So delusion includes both being ignorant of and ignoring. So whether it's an active or a passive gesture within the way our mind is working, that has impact. So normally we're just like ignoring all this other stuff that's going on. So you can be like, well, do I like that or not? What do I want to do with it? Can I manipulate it? Can I get some more of that? Can I get rid of it? So this idea that things are dependent has a lot of implications. In fact, arguably the whole system pivots on this, and it's one of the most basic teachings of Buddhism. But here, I want to just say, what this points to is that everything is always collective. Everything is always collective. So we think like, oh, you did a dumb thing, I'm mad at you. And it's like a lot of conditions created that dumb thing. And the impacts will go out. And the way I'm responding are produced by previous conditions that are shared by countless people. I mean, think about your emotional tendencies and your ways of viewing things are formed not just by your immediate family and your friends and their ancestors and all the cultural experiences you've ever had. I mean, it's really big. So this is why Thich Nhat Hanh says, like, when you see a flower that's not doing well, you're not like, stupid flower. Well, I'm not very good at gardening, so I might. But he's like kind of assuming our better natures. And you don't think stupid flower. You think, well, something is not working for this flower. It's not getting enough light. It's not getting enough sun. It's not getting enough dirt. So you shift from blaming and this idea of control to like, how can we contribute to the conditions that will produce something more beautiful? And this is really basic, goes right back to the most root teaching of Buddhism, the Four Noble Truths. It says there's suffering. The suffering is caused by wanting things to be other than how they are. You can end suffering, and that will be the end of wanting things to be other than how they are. And then the fourth one isn't just do that. It doesn't say just stop suffering. It doesn't say just stop craving. It doesn't say that. That would be really hard. I don't recommend it. All right, I'm going to stop right now. That's too hard. What it says is there's a path that leads to the end of suffering. These are the conditions to which you can contribute that will create liberation. So the idea of a dependent nature can invite us to feel a sense of intimacy with all of life. It's like, wow, I was out there walking, and I'm like, oh, big day, my book release day. And then like 400,000 people ran down on their marathon day. So my book release day is pretty small. All these people poured their lives into preparing for this. And it's a big deal, and their families are going to meet them. This is true every moment. You walk down the street, there are thousands of people you're passing with their own lives. So beautiful. We're intimate with that. Always. We might not notice it. We may ignore or be ignorant of it. But it's still true. Everything is of a dependent nature. And so sometimes it feels pretty good. I was out looking at the maple trees yesterday. Wow, sumacs. What is even that tree that's so pink? Just feeling connected to nature through opening my eyes. It's very beautiful. But also, understanding the dependent nature helps us see that we can't be separate from the harmful systems that we live in. So it's like we can, instead of like saying, oh, some stupid person is making climate change, this invites us to be like, I am part of this and I have a role to play. Climate change, addiction, systemic problems, whether they're yours or not. Climate change, addiction, patriarchy, racism, transphobia, trauma, economic exploitation, homophobia, ableism. It's all going on. And it's not out there. It's always within the whole thing. And so that can be a little painful to hear. Couldn't I just blame someone else and pretend it's not happening? Well, yes, we will. Pretty sure. We all do that. But it's also true that we can open up to it. And then instead of being like, oh God, every time it comes up, I'm just being stabbed. You'd be like, yep, I know this is real. And I know that I have a part to play in doing something that will be beneficial. Everyone. It doesn't matter which side you're on. No person is left out of the possibility of liberation in this tradition. Because of the dependent nature. We're all dependently together. I'm going to read a little bit about this. We don't passively receive the reality of the world through our senses and then respond to it. The world we experience is created. It is, as Vasubandhu says, the active cognition of seer and seeing. Our life is created by our karma, and we create karma in every moment. We have the power to plant seeds that will create a better world. This body of teachings emphasizes the impact of each moment of intentionality. Our power lies in the quality of heart and mind we offer to the moments. Why do I think this worldview is more effective than materialism for healing our suffering and freeing us from collective modes of violence, oppression, and destruction? I will answer with some lines from a Chinese Chan nun named Baoqi. Baoqi wrote, "The vastness of karmic consciousness is hard to prove, but when Mr. Zhang drinks, then Mr. Li gets drunk." Which is weird, right? It's all kind of funny. When Mr. Zhang drinks, then Mr. Li gets drunk. Sometimes I get a call or I see an obituary telling me that another friend of mine has died from addiction. I'm a recovering addict myself. I've lost a dozen friends so far, and I can never know what part my enabling of their intoxication played or the impact their deaths and addictions will have on future generations of their families. The web is too complex to map with materialist tools. I can never know the impact of the thousands of hours I've spent working with addicts in recovery either. I have witnessed the awakening of so much freedom. One of Baoqi's inspirations, the great Chan nun Miaozhang wrote, "When outside the diamond door he glowered, inside the stable door, the wooden horse's face turned red." In the verse above, there is no physical connection between the man's glower and the wooden horse's face, and yet there is a reaction and a connection. We cannot ultimately know when or where the results of any karmic seed will manifest, but manifest they will. Miaozhong wrote her lines in a Chan compilation she created in the 12th century. But could she have known that in the 17th century, Baoqi and her Dharma sister Zugui, looking to revive the rarely recorded teachings of a female master of Chan, would pull them from obscurity and write their own commentaries? Or that Beata Grant in the 21st century would again revive them in English? I don't think she knew that would happen in the 12th century. No, I'm just going to make a conjecture. I believe that buying a chunk of an animal killed thousands of miles away, or offering a caring smile for a person on the street, as well as each tiny moment of anxiety, desire, or compassion you cultivate, has an impact on every living being. And I can't measure it. Miaozhong says the wooden horse's face turns red. A wooden horse is a classic Buddhist metaphor for something that has no reality or causal agency, like the horns of a rabbit, a wooden man, or a stone woman. Miaozhong invites us into a worldview of mystery, where we don't know or see what is ultimately real, but where an angry glare causes suffering we can't calculate, where a smile has radiance beyond the limits of knowing, where our actions really matter. All of this isn't real, but it's as real as it gets. It's as real as it gets. I'd like to credit Monica Reedy, one of my students, for my enthusiasm for the phrase "it's as real as it gets." When I was ordained with Busho Lan, and she made a little card. She's an artist, and it was like a wrestling card, like a wrestling poster, but it was like two Buddhas showing up for a wrestling match, and it said, "As real as it gets." The complete realized nature. Everything already isn't what you think it is. There's something happening here right now, but you don't know what it is. That's a quotation too. Bob Dylan. But it's amazingly salient. It's almost precisely the 26th verse of Vasubandhu's treatise on consciousness only. Anyway, so this makes you like, well, who cares? What matters is that the things that cause us to suffer, we think things are away and they can be grasped or gotten rid of. And that's an illusion. So this is one of the startling and challenging teachings of this tradition. We chant the Heart Sutra so we can just be like, I don't know what any of this is. It's groundlessness. So that's not an easy teaching to take. I'd rather be like, yeah, I've got it figured out. And that's okay. We live in our imagination. It matters. But we can also open up to the fact that it's not what we think it is. And all the suffering comes from how we're viewing it together. I'm just going to read one more section from the book here, and then say some closing words after that. So this book is set up, it's a translation, which I did with Wei Zhen Tang, of Vasubandhu's treatise on three natures, which is 38 verses long. And each chapter is a commentary on one verse. The translation is from Sanskrit. The verses are really hard to understand, so I'm not even sharing them here. You need the commentary. Anyway, this verse, 18th verse, says that the imaginary is the same as the complete realized nature, because the complete realized nature is simply the truth that the imaginary is not real. If we recall the last verse, we can see that this means that suffering and non-suffering are inseparable. Samsara and nirvana are one. Seeing the truth about samsara is liberation from suffering, but not liberation from samsara. Rather, it is liberation that is inseparable from samsara. The American journalist Ida B. Wells was a co-founder of the NAACP. She was born enslaved, friends of hers were lynched, and she worked throughout her life to make a better world. She's best known for using the press to publicize lynchings. She saw how people ignored or denied brutal violence being used to oppress Black people, and she saw the power of turning toward the truth of suffering. She once wrote, "The way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them." Although she wrote this phrase in a particular and horrifying context, it bears a universal wisdom. The root of Buddhist teachings is to turn towards and acknowledge suffering. This is the first noble truth. We know that we are in samsara and that suffering is vast, varied, and epical, for we see and are those hearts and bodies that must bear it. This verse of Vasubandhu's invites us to turn this truth again and to see that samsara and nirvana are one. Escape is not real, but peace is possible wherever we are. We can see the complete realized nature in the imaginary, so the energy of our lives manifests compassion, joy, and peace for the benefit of all amid the suffering. In Vasubandhu's Mahayana Samgraha Bhashya, he writes, all afflicted phenomena are called samsara, and the nature of identitylessness of these afflicted phenomena is called nirvana. You got that? Bodhisattvas realize the identitylessness of all phenomena. They see that phenomena lack any nature and that the whole of samsara is nirvana by virtue of the utter peacefulness they perceive. The Dalai Lama lives in exile, as do hundreds of thousands of his countryfolk. When he was young, his home nation of Tibet was invaded by China, and it remains under brutal occupation. Yet even as he acknowledges the suffering of his people and works for repair, pouring his life into creating a more just and loving world, he does it with such lightness, warmth, and humor. A friend saw the Dalai Lama giving a talk to several thousand people on a stage lined with dignitaries. Afterwards, as he walked off the stage, the Dalai Lama looked down and saw a napkin someone had dropped. He bent over, picked it up, carefully folded it, and placed it back on the table and continued walking. Although these verses seem so lofty, the vision they propose so hard to attain, we can see actual people manifesting the wisdom that we can be both happy and at peace while we turn our hearts, bodies, and minds towards healing our world. We cannot expect or demand anyone to do this, but we can be inspired. Look to your friends when they do this and take inspiration from them. The limits of this capacity have yet to be found, and our world's need for them is vast. Oh, yeah, Thich Nhat Hanh. It's like a lot of people know Thich Nhat Hanh. So wonderful, so peaceful, beautiful books. This is a person who lived through a brutal war. He killed like 3% of the population of his country. He was exiled from his home country for 20 or 30 years. He worked so hard with so many people, and yet you all get the feeling he was just joyful. This is possible. And of course, it's tough because we talk about these icons, but you can look for it and see people doing it. You see someone who's like, okay, sometimes when your friends have a baby, they're just like, I'm going crazy, I can't sleep, and I'm gonna die. That's true. But sometimes they're so radiant to have that time, even though it's exhausting and confusing and hard, to just be with someone to take care of them. So the complete realized nature says everything is already what Buddhists see. Buddhists don't see something other than what you see. You're seeing what Buddhists see, and you're seeing is Buddha's seeing. It may seem weird, but it's already not what you think it is. And that's what Buddhists know. It's not what I think it is. And here we are together, and I can do something of benefit. Thank you all for listening. It's a joy to be able to talk about Vasubandhu's beautiful teachings. Yeah. So I wonder, maybe other people would like to say things doesn't seem like collective work liberation is going to work out with only one person talking all the time, to me. So if people have like thoughts or questions or reflections, they're quite welcome. And if you're on the Zoom meeting, I think you just gotta open up the mic and start talking.
I will say, Ben, from my other experience with Vasubandhu, that this is different, right? It's difficult stuff when you engage with it and find out how wrong you are. Wow, and it can be painful, and it can be, so it's really nice to have community where we can kind of rest and learn from. And so thank you for some more explanations of things that I don't know about.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. It is like, oh, I'm so deluded. But you know, that can be kind of hard, but it's kind of wonderful to just get used to it. Because it's so big. I'm like, oh, my big day. And then it's like, oh, 10,000 other people having their own big day. It's always true. But you know what I didn't talk about here is there's quite a bit in the book about how the very simple way we do things here that isn't have all these fancy words for it, they open you up to this. Just when you sit and look at that wall, you start to notice, oh, that's just a thought. You know, it just happens. That's not a real thing. It's just a thought. And you know, as we care for the space together, when we clean together, when we cook together, when we listen to bells together, we create we begin to feel in our bodies our collectivity and the dependent nature of our phenomenon. So I'm gonna get one and come back to you. Go ahead.
I started my master's in marriage and family therapy, which has this thrust on systems and systemic thinking. And I like, you know, it's really changing. Well, it's changing everything. It's a big lens that's in the process of changing. But this adds a dimension to that systems thinking that I find really exciting. And this, because, you know, we think systems of, we talk about racism and we talk about the relationship between individuals in a family or the history of a family or whatever. But this, this less sort of being able to point to things way of seeing a system is really like adds this.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, and arguably the early Buddhist teachings, a lot of the systemic thinking is implicit in a certain sense. The Yogacarans would argue they're making it more explicit. And then when you move into Huayan, it's really like, oh, we're going to talk about this all the time in the most fun ways. Anyway, go ahead.
Just a couple of things. We're in Minnesota because of our grandson, who's like 1.5.
I'm just going to invite you to bring your voice. So,
okay, yeah. So with the grandchild, there's a new study out yesterday on generational epigenetic transmission, which means the traumas that my parents experienced can be manifested in my grandson. And it's epigenetic, it's not just environmental. So the system here goes on to genetics even. So this incredible transgenerational dependency is really an amazing reality around this dependence. The other question I had is, I don't know what your thoughts about identity and imagination, because who I think I am, who do I think I am? And who do you think I am? That's all illusion. Who I think I am is not true, or whatever that means, or it's not accurate, or I made it up. I made up who I think I am. So, okay, who am I? What about identity? Who are we?
Yeah, well, we have the appearance of a sense of identity that we hold and that other people have, and that matters because it's imaginary. But you know, this is an invitation to see, like, well, are we imagining that in a way that's beneficial or not? I used to be like, I'm a terrible person, so I'm not going to bother trying. That was my worldview. It didn't work out that great for anyone around me or me. And I was like, that's not a beneficial thing. And now it's like, oh, it's more mysteries, and we can see how ways we view ourselves binds us. And sometimes it's like, oh, this is a useful way of viewing myself at this time. But this does not it denies the ultimacy of identity, but it doesn't deny the impact of identity. So it's not an ultimate truth, but it matters. And so understanding, it's like, oh, who I am. As a male person, when I'm walking down the street in the dark and I see a woman walking down the street, I will cross the street so they don't have to walk near me, because I know that we live in a framework where there's pervasive violence against women. So it's like I can understand identity and use that to take actions that are beneficial. And you could do that all the time. Well, thank you.
I have a question.
Yeah.
It's kind of a wordsmith question. It's about I think it's your choice to use the word imaginary to hold that piece of the structure that you explained to us. Did you, from the original Sanskrit, whatever it was, and I don't know what it was, did you think of other ways that you could translate that word? I think the way you're using it is a very creative, positive way, but you could also receive it in a negative way, like it's an imaginary friend, some negative thing, whereas you're positing it as a creative, using your imagination. So that's a two-part question. Did you consider other choices? I think illusory was one that you've been kind of using, perhaps interchangeably. And I keep thinking of Kadambari Roshi's word provisionary and trying to figure out in my mind if it's the same thing that you're talking about. Like that things, it's not that things don't exist, it's that they exist provisionally as like one of the two truths. So anything you want to do with that, I would love to hear what you have to say.
Fun. First off, imaginary friends. Has anyone seen Snuffleupagus? Come on, it's awesome. Imaginary friends, big thumbs up. So the imaginary nature. So parikalpita is the original term, parikalpita svabaha, which means pari, thoroughly, kalpa. I'll unpack that more. Svabaha means own being, having its own being. So that's what's generally translated as nature. So kalpa has a number of constituent kind of meanings: conceptualized, imputed, imagined. Doesn't necessarily have provisional, but I do want to talk about that because that's interesting. So conceptualized, imputed, and imagined would all be very reasonable translations. And yes, I and Wei Zhang, but I kind of drive this part of the process, wanted to go with imaginary because it does, I think it's more evocative. So if I say, yeah, everything's of an imputational nature, you're like, well, let me get my dictionary. Whereas, it's kind of, you go, oh, I think I know something about imagination. So it sounds less technical to me. But I think the thing is, it is true that it's often the case in Buddhist teachings that when we refer to things as imaginary, we're trying to get us to detach from them. So like at the end of the Diamond Sutra, it says, just like in illusion, a phantom, a bubble in a stream, an imagination or a dream, so all conditioned phenomena should be seen. That's like trying to help us just go, like, no, right now. So like calling it imaginary can have that effect. But the nice thing is it's a word with a lot of connotations. So it also can carry this very positive sense of imagination and creation because we're actively involved in creating. So that's the first part. So to relate these to the two truths, I'm just going to do this very briefly. So provisional, or what are the really common translations of the provisional? I'll say
Ultimate.
Yeah, provisional ultimate. We'll say that. Provisional ultimate truth. Things are because of dependency, they're provisional. Right? That's the basic proof. Because they depend on other things, provisionally something arises. And because of dependency, they're actually empty because they're just provisional. So that's basically, I'm running through this kind of quickly. That's basically the structure of how the true truths works. The three natures just says, instead of saying because it's dependent, it's provisional, and because it's dependent, it's empty, it says, well, it's imaginary, so it amplifies the mental component or the creative component. It says its nature is dependent, so it's not just the reason why, but it has the nature of dependency. And then the ultimate nature or the absolute nature is very equivalent to the complete realized nature. So there's more about that in this book for those of you who really like highly technical Buddhist philosophical exposition. We've got some in there, I promise. So, and whenever you have a great question like that, then I just want to say, you don't have to be scared to just be like, I'm really grumpy, what can I do? That's also a very reasonable question to bring to a Dharma talk. So all ranges, whatever. Yeah, anyone who's in the online meeting want to say anything? Okay, I wish we could just get a microphone on that dog and listen to them bark, or pant. That would be nice. Thank you. Well, anyone else?
Yeah.
Okay.
One thing, one quote I thought, I forget where it came from, but it's not what it looks like, but it's not any different either. Yeah, it's kind of similar, but it's also this one thing I was thinking about was with everything relating to the karmas. Like a lot of times at work we'll have some sort of problem, and there'll be like years of history on how we got to this spot, and kind of everyone, well, this is generalizing, but everyone around is kind of like mad, blaming each other. I'm doing that in my own head, and it's like really complicated, and it's not a clear cut forward, but like it usually happens when we're like sort of like under the gun to make something happen, and I just feel like all the karma comes to like the tip of a needle, which is like the present moment, and that's like, okay, what's in front of us right now? And we have to do something, which is really nice, because then it kind of puts the ownership back to where you are, and you can make something happen like somewhat peacefully. And it's just then you kind of deal with all the backstory later after you kind of work that out, but you get to set the story aside for a little bit. And then the second thought was, I kind of like being able to like have something to work with dealing with all the karma, and being able to hold it lightly too, because it can get like very overwhelming once we start unpacking the karma and all of your relationships. You know, when you think about the food you eat, and then like the car you drive, and all of these other implications that are like producing suffering, and then you just kind of feel like you have a hard time like getting through your own day, and now we have all this other stuff to worry about, and then it gets like overwhelming. And like I've seen people too, including myself, who've been felt like, okay, like I'm just gonna like disassociate, and because you can't handle it, so it's it just feels good that to know that there's a practice that we can do to be able to handle it all, handle it lightly without falling into despair.
Yeah, despair is real. So if you're despairing, then we can hold that together. There's space for that. But hopefully we come together. Some teachings that remind us that it's like we can always do something. And when you're really despairing, sometimes it's like getting out of bed. Big achievement. There are people today for whom the big achievement will be getting out of bed. And that's an amazing act of liberation for those people to make that choice. And for some of us, it might look a little bit more grand. But finally, this all just comes down onto that needle tip, and then let's do something. Okay, time for one more remark.
Yeah, I was just gonna comment kind of on the same lines of just how practical of a tool it is to kind of when you're in a stressful situation, you have a patient or somebody you're working with, and it's very tense to kind of look at those conditions that created that environment and then how you contributed to that. How you yourself have contributed to that situation and what you can do to make that situation better. I feel that's very practical, at least for myself, in terms of tend to put the blame on somebody else, like, why are you being like that? But then to take some ownership of like, okay, I'm here in this position, this is my role. What do I have the power to change in this dynamic to make this situation a little bit better for all of us here? I think that just, like you said, it's a very empowering thing. It's something that gives you power to kind of control that situation. So of course we can't control anything. So
we're getting it together here. Thank you. Yeah. And in Yogacara, we call it conceptualizing the interdependent, a basic practice to think about interdependency to help us see it. But it's also true that you can see it without thinking at all. You just meet it. You see someone and you know the interdependence with that person. Feel it, we embody it, and we practice Zazen because that becomes an embodied reality for us. That we are inescapably together with everything. So thank you all. It's been fun hanging out. I'll be in the backyard in a little bit. Well, a huge box of books. All right, I'm going to turn it over to our Dawn. Okay.